The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets as Staff Sergeant Maria adjusted her body armor one final time. The weight of her gear felt heavier than usual, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the intelligence reports that had been coming in all week about increased insurgent activity in Sector 7, or maybe it was the photograph tucked inside her helmet of her 3-year-old daughter Sophia back home in Texas. Maria had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months now, serving as a medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. At 28 years old, she had already seen more combat than most soldiers twice her age. Her unit respected her not just for her medical expertise, but for her calm demeanor under fire and her unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home alive. The briefing that morning had been routine. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes stood before the assembled squad, pointing to aerial photographs of a suspected weapons cache in a residential area about 3 kilometers from their forward operating base. Intelligence suggested the building had been used to store improvised explosive devices and ammunition that insurgents were using against coalition forces throughout the region. Listened intently as Barnes outlined the mission parameters. Her squad of 12 soldiers would conduct a dawn raid on the compound, secure any weapons or intelligence materials, and return to base before the afternoon heat made operations unbearable. It was supposed to be a straightforward search and seizure operation, the kind they had executed dozens of times before. As the team prepared their vehicles, performed her usual pre-mission ritual. She checked and rechecked her medical supplies, ensuring she had enough combat gauze, tourniquets, and morphine to treat multiple casualties if needed. Her fellow soldiers often joked that she carried enough medical equipment to stock a field hospital, but knew that in urban combat, being overprepared could mean the difference between life and death. The convoy consisted of 3 armored Humvees, each carrying 4 soldiers. Rode in the second vehicle alongside Sergeant First Class, who served as the squad's communications specialist, Private Martinez, a young soldier from California on his first deployment, and Corporal Jackson, a veteran of Afghanistan who had volunteered for this Iraq tour to stay with his unit. As they rolled through the empty streets noticed how different the city looked in the early morning hours. The usual bustle of merchants setting up their stalls and children walking to school was absent. Most windows were shuttered, and the few civilians they encountered quickly disappeared into doorways and alleyways. The silence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. Its radio crackled with routine check-ins from the other vehicles. Everything appeared normal as they approached the target area. The building they were heading to was a 3-story concrete structure typical of Iraqi construction, with flat roofs and small windows. According to their intelligence, the weapons cache was believed to be hidden in the basement. Felt her heart rate increase slightly as they neared the objective. She had learned to trust her instincts during her time in combat, and something about this morning felt different. The streets were too quiet, even for the early hour. She mentioned her concerns to, who nodded and increased his scanning of the surrounding buildings through his rifle scope. The convoy came to a halt 2 blocks from the target building. The soldiers quickly dismounted and began their approach on foot, moving in practiced tactical formations through the narrow alleys. Carried her M4 rifle in one hand and her medical bag in the other, constantly scanning for signs of danger while staying close to Martinez, who she noticed was breathing heavily from nervousness. As they reached the final corner before the target building, Lieutenant, the squad leader, called for a brief halt. He used hand signals to position his soldiers for the assault. Would enter with the second wave, ready to provide medical support if anyone was wounded during the initial breach. The building stood before them, seemingly empty and abandoned. Its concrete walls were pockmarked with bullet holes from previous fighting, and several windows on the upper floors had been blown out. Graffiti in Arabic covered much of the lower wall, some of it anti-American slogans that had learned to recognize during her deployment. Gave the signal to move forward. The first team rushed toward the main entrance whilst group prepared to follow. In those final moments before the assault began, thought briefly of Sophia and whispered a quiet prayer that everyone would make it home safely. The front door of the building exploded inward as the breaching charge detonated. Soldiers poured through the opening, their voices echoing through the empty rooms as they shouted clear from each space they secured. Followed close behind, her medical training making her automatically assess each soldier for signs of injury as they moved through the building. The ground floor appeared to be abandoned residential space, with scattered furniture and debris from previous combat operations. The team found evidence of recent occupation, including empty food containers and fresh cigarette butts, but no weapons or insurgents. Directed half the squad to search the upper floors whilst team headed toward the basement stairs. The stairway leading down was narrow and dark, forcing the soldiers to move in single file. Positioned herself third in line, behind and Martinez, with Jackson bringing up the rear. Their tactical flashlights cut through the darkness as they descended, the beams revealing concrete steps covered in dust and debris. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a heavy wooden door reinforced with metal brackets. Tried the handle and found it locked. He signaled for explosives to breach the door, but before the charges could be set, heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the distinctive metallic click of an AK-47 safety being disengaged, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the door. The ambush that followed would change life forever, though in those final seconds of relative safety, she had no way of knowing what was about to unfold. Her last coherent thought before the shooting started was wondering if she would ever see her daughter's face again. The basement erupted in a storm of gunfire and concrete dust. The heavy wooden door splintered as automatic weapons fire tore through it from the other side. Threw herself against the stairway wall as bullets whistled past her head, the confined space amplifying the deafening crack of rifle rounds and the sharp ping of ricochets off concrete. Was hit first, watched in horror as the communications specialist spun sideways, blood spreading across his chest armor. He tried to speak into his radio but only managed a gurgling sound before collapsing on the narrow stairway. Martinez, positioned directly in front of the door, caught the worst of the initial barrage. 3 rounds struck him center mass, and he fell backward, his rifle clattering down the concrete steps. His medical training kicked in instantly, overriding her fear. Even as bullets continued to shred the wooden door above her, she crawled forward toward Martinez, pulling her medical bag behind her. The young soldier was conscious but struggling to breathe, blood frothing from his mouth indicating likely lung damage. She needed to get him stabilized and evacuated immediately. Jackson, positioned at the top of the stairs, was returning fire through the destroyed door, trying to suppress the insurgents long enough for it to work. His rifle chattered in controlled bursts as he called into his radio for backup and air support. The insurgents had chosen their ambush site perfectly, funneling the American soldiers into a narrow stairway with no room to maneuver. From the basement came angry shouting in Arabic as the hidden fighters repositioned themselves. Could hear at least 3 distinct voices, suggesting they were facing a well-prepared enemy position. The concrete walls of the basement provided excellent protection for the insurgents while leaving the Americans completely exposed on the stairway. Managed to apply a chest seal to Martinez's wounds and started an IV line to combat shock. The soldier's eyes were wide with fear, but he remained conscious and alert. She whispered reassurances to him while simultaneously treating, who had taken a round through his shoulder that had somehow missed his major arteries. The gunfight intensified as more insurgents joined the battle from other positions in the building. Could hear heavy footsteps on the floors above them, indicating that team was engaged in their own firefight. The carefully planned operation had turned into a complex ambush, with American forces trapped on multiple levels of the building. Jackson's ammunition ran low, forcing him to make the dangerous decision to reload while under fire. In that brief moment when his suppressing fire stopped, the insurgents pushed their advantage. 2 fighters rushed up the basement stairs, their AK-47s blazing. Jackson managed to drop one with his pistol, but the second insurgent made it to the stairway landing. Found herself face to face with a young Iraqi man, probably no older than 20, his eyes wild with adrenaline and fear. For a split second, they simply stared at each other across the narrow space. She could see the confusion in his expression as he processed that she was a woman, a female American soldier treating wounded enemies in the basement of what should have been his stronghold. That moment of hesitation saved life, giving Jackson time to put 2 rounds into the insurgent's chest. But the brief firefight had cost them precious time. More voices echoed from the basement, and realized they were facing a larger force than intelligence had suggested. The weapons cache they had come to secure was apparently well defended by a significant insurgent cell. Despite his wound, managed to get his radio working long enough to call for immediate medical evacuation. His voice was weak but clear as he reported multiple casualties and requested urgent air support. The response crackled back that helicopter gunships were en route, but would need 20 minutes to reach their position. Knew they didn't have 20 minutes. Martinez was deteriorating despite her treatment, and she could hear more insurgents moving through the building above them. Jackson's ammunition was running dangerously low, and she herself only carried a basic combat load since most of her gear space was dedicated to medical supplies. The decision to retreat came from over the radio. His team on the upper floors was also taking heavy casualties and running low on ammunition. The intelligence had been wrong about this being a simple weapons cache. They had walked into a prepared insurgent stronghold, possibly a command center for the entire sector. Getting the wounded out would be the challenge. Martinez couldn't walk and was weakening from blood loss. Would have to coordinate their withdrawal while continuing to provide medical care to keep both men alive. Jackson volunteered to provide rear guard, knowing it was likely a one-way mission. As they prepared to move, heard something that chilled her to the bone. Voices speaking English with American accents were coming from other parts of the building. Not American soldiers, but insurgent propaganda being broadcast through speakers hidden throughout the structure. The psychological warfare was designed to confuse and demoralize the trapped soldiers. The withdrawal began with and supporting Martinez between them while Jackson laid down covering fire. They had to climb back up the narrow stairway while insurgents fired at them from the basement. Each step was agony as tried to keep Martinez's IV line intact while avoiding the bullets that chipped concrete around them. Halfway up the stairs, felt the first impact. A round struck her in the right shoulder, spinning her around and nearly causing her to drop Martinez. The pain was immediate and intense, but her adrenaline kept her moving. She could feel warm blood running down her arm inside her combat shirt, but she refused to let go of the wounded soldier she was helping to evacuate. 2 more rounds hit her as they reached the ground floor. One grazed her left thigh, tearing through her uniform pants and leaving a burning track across her leg. The other struck her ceramic body armor plate, the impact feeling like being hit by a sledgehammer. The plate cracked but held, distributing the energy across her chest and probably saving her life. Jackson was hit moments later, a burst of automatic fire catching him as he turned to follow them up the stairs. Watched him stumble and fall, his rifle sliding across the floor. She had to make an impossible choice: continue evacuating Martinez or go back for Jackson, who was now trapped at the bottom of the stairway with multiple insurgents closing in. Her training told her to continue the evacuation. You save who you can save, but couldn't leave a soldier behind, especially one who had risked his life to save hers. She helped position Martinez against a wall where he could provide some covering fire despite his wounds, then turned back toward the stairway where Jackson lay motionless. The basement had gone quiet, which knew was a bad sign. The insurgents were likely regrouping for another assault or moving to flank their position. She had perhaps minutes before the building would be overrun. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors, but the medical evacuation was still too far away to help with the immediate crisis. Checked her ammunition and found she had 2 full magazines remaining. Her medical bag was nearly empty after treating her wounded teammates. Her own injuries were slowing her down, and she could feel her strength ebbing as blood loss began to affect her coordination. But Jackson was still alive, and as long as he breathed, she wouldn't abandon him. The last thing she remembered clearly was the sound of her boots on the concrete floor as she ran back toward the stairway where her fellow soldier lay wounded. After that, everything would become a blur of gunfire, pain, and the desperate struggle to survive in the basement of a building that had become her tomb. Never made it back to Jackson. As she reached the top of the stairway, a coordinated assault from multiple directions caught her in a crossfire that would have killed most soldiers instantly. The insurgents had used the brief lull to position fighters throughout the ground floor, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the building's interior into a killing zone. The first rounds came from her left side, striking her in rapid succession. One bullet shattered her left elbow, sending her rifle spinning away across the concrete floor. Another punched through her right side just below her body armor, the impact doubling her over in agony. A third round caught her in the left leg, shattering her femur and dropping her to the ground where she became an even easier target. Tried to crawl toward cover behind an overturned desk, leaving a trail of blood on the dusty floor. But the insurgents had anticipated this, positioning themselves to eliminate any possible escape routes. 2 more bullets found their mark, one striking her in the back, just missing her spine, and another tearing through her right arm. Despite the devastating injuries, combat training kept her alive. She managed to pull her pistol with her one functioning hand and return fire, buying herself precious seconds. Her shots were wild and uncoordinated due to blood loss and shock, but they forced the insurgents to take cover, disrupting their systematic execution of the wounded American soldiers. In the chaos of the gunfight, she heard S voice over the radio, weak but determined, calling in their exact coordinates for air support. Martinez, despite his own severe injuries, was still providing covering fire from his position against the wall. These men refused to give up, even facing overwhelming odds and certain death. The building shook as the first helicopter gunship arrived overhead. The sound of its rotors was like thunder, and felt a surge of hope despite her injuries. But her relief was short-lived as she realized the insurgents had prepared for air support. Heavy machine gun fire erupted from hidden positions on the roof, engaging the helicopter and forcing it to maintain distance. Was hit again as she tried to reach position. This time the bullet struck her in the stomach, the impact causing her to vomit blood across the concrete floor. She could feel her strength draining away with each heartbeat, her vision beginning to blur at the edges. Her body was shutting down from trauma and blood loss. But something inside refused to accept defeat. Perhaps it was the photograph of her daughter that she could feel pressing against her chest inside her uniform. Maybe it was her oath as a medic to never abandon wounded soldiers. Or possibly it was simple stubborn determination that had carried her through a difficult childhood in San and motivated her to join the army in the first place. She managed to crawl close enough to check his condition. The communications specialist was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. His radio was still functional, and she could hear voices coordinating rescue efforts. Help was coming, but whether they could hold out long enough remained doubtful. 2 more rounds struck as she worked on wounds. One grazed her scalp, filling her eyes with blood and making it nearly impossible to see. The other hit her in the right shoulder, the same arm that had been wounded earlier. She was now hit in 8 different places, her combat uniform soaked with blood and her body armor cracked in multiple locations. The insurgents began shouting to each other in Arabic, their voices excited and urgent. Didn't speak the language, but their tone suggested they were preparing for something significant. Through her blurred vision, she could see movement as fighters repositioned throughout the building, possibly preparing to escape before American reinforcements arrived. Martinez, the young soldier from California, crawled over to his position despite his own severe chest wounds. His face was pale and covered with sweat, but his eyes were clear and determined. He had salvaged extra ammunition from Jackson's position and was sharing it with, ensuring they could continue fighting even if help was delayed. The building shook again as explosive charges detonated on the upper floors. His team was apparently still alive and fighting, using breaching charges to move between rooms and avoid the insurgent positions. The sound of American M4 rifles mixed with the sharper crack of AK-47s in a deadly symphony that echoed through the concrete structure. Felt another impact, this one in her left side just above her hip. She was now wounded in 9 different places, her body a roadmap of bullet wounds and trauma. Yet somehow she remained conscious and alert, her medical training helping her understand exactly how badly injured she was while simultaneously keeping her functional enough to continue fighting. The radio crackled with news that Marine reinforcements were moving toward their position, but they were still at least 30 minutes away. Did quick mental math and realized the timeline was impossible. At her current rate of blood loss, she would be unconscious within 20 minutes and dead within 40. And Martinez were in similar condition, their survival measured in minutes rather than hours. But had made a decision. If she was going to die in this concrete building she was going to take as many insurgents with her as possible. More importantly, she was going to keep her wounded soldiers alive until help arrived, regardless of what it cost her personally. That was her job, her duty, and her honor as an American soldier. She managed to establish a defensive position in a corner where 2 walls provided cover from most directions. And Martinez, though severely wounded, could still provide some covering fire. Together, the 3 soldiers created a small fortress within the larger battle, determined to hold out against overwhelming odds. The insurgents seemed to recognize the change in their opponent's tactics. The random, desperate firing of wounded soldiers had transformed into controlled, disciplined resistance, had positioned her small team to maximize their defensive capabilities while conserving ammunition for the most critical shots. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the floor of the building, felt her consciousness starting to fade. She had been wounded 10 times now, the latest bullet catching her in the right leg as she adjusted her position. Her body was failing, systems shutting down one by one as trauma and blood loss overwhelmed her reserves. But something remarkable happened as her vision dimmed and her strength ebbed away. Instead of panic or despair, felt a strange sense of peace. She had done her job. She had protected her soldiers and given them the best possible chance of survival. Whatever happened next was beyond her control. Her last clear memory of the battle was the sound of radio crackling with the news that Navy SEALs were being deployed for immediate extraction. Elite warriors were coming for them, soldiers who specialized in impossible rescues and never left anyone behind. If anyone could reach them in time, it would be the SEALs. Smiled as consciousness finally slipped away. She had held the line long enough. Now she just had to survive whatever came next, hidden in the basement of a ruined building inn, waiting for warriors to find her and bring her home. Drifted in and out of consciousness for the next 48 hours, existing in a twilight world between life and death. Her body had entered survival mode, shutting down non-essential functions to conserve what little energy remained. Yet somehow, impossibly, her heart continued beating despite the massive trauma and blood loss that should have killed her hours ago. The building around her had fallen silent after the insurgents retreated. They had taken their dead and wounded with them, leaving behind only empty shell casings and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Had died sometime during the night, his radio finally going quiet after hours of intermittent calls for assistance. Martinez hung on longer, talking deliriously about his mother's tamales and his girlfriend back in Los Angeles before he too slipped away. Was alone now, surrounded by the bodies of her fellow soldiers in the basement of a building that had become a tomb. She should have died with them, but her body refused to surrender. Some combination of training, determination, and pure biological stubbornness kept her alive when all logic suggested death was inevitable. The first day passed in a haze of pain and confusion. His mind wandered between memories of her childhood, training exercises at fort, and hallucinations brought on by blood loss and dehydration. She talked to her daughter, Sophia, describing the stars she could see through a crack in the basement ceiling, promising to come home and read bedtime stories. Her wounds had largely stopped bleeding, the body's natural clotting mechanisms finally overcoming the trauma. But infection was already beginning to set in, her body temperature rising as her immune system fought bacteria introduced by the dirty bullets and concrete debris. Without medical intervention, sepsis would kill her within days even if the initial trauma didn't. Rationed the water in her canteen with military precision, allowing herself only small sips every few hours. Her combat rations remained untouched. The thought of food made her nauseous, and she lacked the strength to open the packages anyway. Her body was beginning to consume itself, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel vital organs. During lucid moments, she could hear helicopters circling overhead, their rotors beating a rhythm that became the soundtrack to her ordeal. Sometimes they sounded close enough to touch, other times they seemed impossibly distant. She tried to signal them by tapping on exposed pipes, but the sound was too weak to carry beyond the basement walls. The second day brought new challenges. His left leg had swollen to twice its normal size, the shattered femur allowing blood and fluid to pool in the surrounding tissue. Her right arm was completely useless, the shoulder wound having damaged nerves that controlled movement. She could only move by dragging herself along the floor with her one functioning limb. Delirium set in as her core body temperature continued rising. Found herself having conversations with her drill sergeant from basic training, arguing with her ex-husband about custody arrangements, and playing peekaboo with Sophia in what she thought was their living room, but was actually the corner of a bombed-out basement in Iraq. Yet through the fevered dreams and hallucinations, one thought remained constant: the SEALs were coming. His final radio transmission had confirmed that Navy Special Operations units were being deployed for search and rescue. These warriors never abandoned their own, and was confident they would find her. She just had to survive long enough. The sound of gunfire in the distance told her the battle was continuing. Sometimes it seemed close enough that she could distinguish individual weapons. Other times it faded to a general rumble like distant thunder. understood that urban warfare was complex and time-consuming, that clearing buildings and securing areas took days or weeks rather than hours. On the second night, she experienced what she later described as a spiritual encounter. Her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident, appeared in the basement and sat beside her on the concrete floor. They talked about family recipes, childhood memories, and the importance of never giving up no matter how difficult things became. Whether this was a hallucination brought on by trauma and fever or something more profound, never knew for certain. But the conversation gave her strength when she had none left, hope when despair seemed overwhelming. Her grandmother's final words before disappearing were simple. "Help is coming. You just hold on a little longer." The third day dawned with barely clinging to consciousness. Her body temperature had spiked to dangerous levels, and she was experiencing periods of delirium that lasted for hours. Her wounds had become infected, red streaks radiating outward from each bullet hole as bacteria spread through her bloodstream. But she could hear something new in the distance, the distinctive sound of heavy weapons and coordinated explosions that suggested a major military operation. The SEALs had arrived in force, systematically clearing buildings in their sector as they searched for survivors. Tried to call out, but her voice was too weak to carry beyond a whisper. Throughout the day, the sounds of combat grew closer. Could distinguish the sharp crack of American rifles from the duller boom of insurgent weapons. Gradually, the American guns began to dominate, suggesting that the Navy specialists were winning the battle for her section of. As afternoon turned to evening, heard something that made her heart race. English voices calling out tactical commands, the professional communication of soldiers conducting building-to-building searches. They were close now, perhaps only a few blocks away. She had to find the strength to signal them when they arrived. Using her one functioning arm, managed to drag herself to a position where she could bang on an exposed water pipe that ran through the basement. The sound was weak and irregular, but it might be enough to catch the attention of highly trained soldiers who were listening for exactly this type of signal. She developed a pattern, 3 quick taps, pause, 3 quick taps, pause, repeating endlessly. It was Morse code for SOS, something any American soldier would recognize immediately. Her strength was fading with each tap, but she forced herself to continue, knowing this might be her only chance. Hours passed. The sounds of combat grew closer, then seemed to move away again. Began to fear that the SEALs had missed her building, that they would continue their search pattern and leave her behind. The thought of dying alone in the basement, after surviving for 3 days, was almost unbearable. But then she heard footsteps directly overhead, moving carefully through the ruins of the ground floor. The sounds were different from the insurgents who had occupied the building earlier, more disciplined, more systematic. These were professional soldiers conducting a thorough search, exactly what she had been praying for. Summoned her remaining strength and began tapping the pipe frantically. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 quick taps, pause. Her vision was graying around the edges, and she could feel consciousness slipping away again. But she forced herself to continue signaling, tapping out her desperate plea for rescue. The footsteps stopped. She could hear voices conferring quietly overhead, the words too muffled to understand, but the tone unmistakably American. Then the footsteps resumed, moving with purpose toward what she hoped was the stairway leading down to her basement prison. Managed one final series of taps before her strength failed completely. As consciousness faded, her last thought was a prayer of gratitude. The SEALs had found her. After 3 days of hell, help had finally arrived. Petty Officer First Class Michael was the first SEAL down the basement stairs. A Navy corpsman with 3 combat deployments behind him, he had seen plenty of battlefield trauma, but nothing had prepared him for what he found in that concrete tomb beneath. 3 American soldiers lay scattered across the basement floor, 2 clearly dead, and one who shouldn't have been alive but somehow was still breathing. Appeared more dead than alive when reached her. Her uniform was soaked with dried blood, her skin was gray from blood loss, and her body temperature was dangerously high from infection. She had 11 separate gunshot wounds, any 3 of which should have been fatal. Yet when checked for a pulse, he found a weak but steady heartbeat that spoke to an incredible will to survive. Immediately called for his team leader, Senior Chief Petty Officer James, a coincidence in names that would later seem meaningful to the wounded soldier. The senior chief took one look at the scene and knew they were dealing with something extraordinary. This soldier had survived 3 days with injuries that typically killed within hours. holding on through pure determination and what could only be described as miraculous endurance. The rescue that followed became legendary within Navy Special Operations circles, and his team had to stabilize enough for transport while working in a basement that could still contain hidden insurgents or booby traps. They established a defensive perimeter while worked frantically to get IV lines started and control the infection that was threatening to finish what the bullets had started. Regained consciousness briefly as worked on her injuries. Her first words were barely audible whispers asking about and Martinez. When gently told her they hadn't made it, tears mixed with the dirt and blood on her face. Even in her critical condition, her first concern was for her fellow soldiers rather than her own survival. The extraction required precision and speed. Was too injured to move safely up the narrow stairway without causing additional trauma. The SEALs had to widen the stairway opening using controlled explosives, then rig a rope system to lift her out of the basement without jarring her broken bones or reopening her wounds. Master Chief Petty Officer David Williams, the team's senior medic, took charge of medical care during the extraction. He had served in combat for 15 years and had never seen anyone survive trauma this extensive. He later told reporters that survival violated every principle of battlefield medicine he had learned during his career. The helicopter ride to the field hospital was touch and go. Vital signs fluctuated wildly as her body struggled with the massive infection and trauma. She coded twice during the flight, her heart stopping completely, only to restart when Williams administered cardiac stimulants. Each time, she fought her way back to consciousness with a determination that amazed the veteran medical team. At the field hospital, surgeons worked for 18 hours straight to repair the damage from her 11 gunshot wounds. They removed bullet fragments from her liver, reconstructed her shattered femur with titanium pins, and repaired damaged organs throughout her abdomen. The surgical team later described the operation as one of the most complex trauma cases they had ever encountered. The first week in the hospital was critical. Developed pneumonia, kidney failure, and multiple secondary infections that threatened to complete what the insurgent bullets had started. She underwent 7 additional surgeries to clean infected tissue and repair complications from her original injuries. Medical staff worked around the clock to keep her alive, inspired by her incredible initial survival. Recovery medical expectations at every stage. Doctors had predicted she would lose her left leg due to the shattered femur and extensive tissue damage. Instead, she regained full function after months of grueling physical therapy. They expected permanent disability from her numerous organ injuries, but her body somehow healed itself more completely than anyone thought possible. The psychological recovery proved as challenging as the physical healing. Suffered from severe PTSD, experiencing nightmares about the basement, and survivors' guilt over San Martinez's deaths. She blamed herself for their loss, believing she should have been able to save them despite the impossible circumstances they faced. Military psychologists worked with for months to help her process the trauma. The breakthrough came when Senior Chief, who had led her rescue, visited during her recovery. He told her that her courage in trying to save Jackson, even while severely wounded herself, had provided the distraction that allowed to get their coordinates to the rescue teams. The medal ceremony took place at Walter Reed Medical Center 8 months after the incident. Received the Silver Star for exceptional valor in combat, recognizing her actions in treating wounded soldiers under fire and holding defensive positions despite multiple life-threatening injuries. Her parents and daughter Sophia were present, along with the families of and Martinez. But the ceremony that meant the most to was smaller and more personal. The Navy SEALs who had rescued her presented her with a special warfare pin, an honor rarely given to non-SEAL personnel. They told her she had demonstrated the warrior spirit that defined their brotherhood, never giving up regardless of the odds against survival. Eventually returned to active duty, though in a training capacity rather than combat operations. She became an instructor at the Army Medical Center, teaching combat medic techniques to new soldiers heading to Iraq and Afghanistan. Her first-hand experience of surviving massive trauma made her uniquely qualified to prepare others for the realities of battlefield medicine. Years later would say that her survival wasn't due to luck or medical miracles, but to the bonds between soldiers that transcend life and death. And Martinez had given their lives to protect her and call for rescue. The SEALs had risked everything to bring her home. Her daughter Sophia had given her a reason to fight when fighting seemed impossible. The basement inn was eventually demolished as part of reconstruction efforts, but kept a piece of concrete from the wall where she had waited for rescue. It sits on her desk at home, a reminder that sometimes the human spirit refuses to surrender even when the body fails. Sometimes 11 bullets aren't enough to stop someone who has people counting on them to come home. Retired from the Army as a sergeant major, having served for 25 years and trained thousands of combat medics. She often tells her students that survival isn't about being stronger or tougher than the enemy. It's about being too stubborn to quit, too loyal to abandon your mission, and too loved by the people waiting at home to give up when things look impossible. That lesson, learned in a basement inn, became her gift to the next generation of warriors.